First of all, thank you everybody for taking the time to attend the webinar today. As the title says, it's how to find and use data and to drive out real results in your organization. One of the things that we at Eide believe, I'm a part of our data analytics practice and technology consulting team, is we believe that we're really heading into a very formative time in the use of data for organizations. And so we think it's a very relevant topic for just about everybody. So by way of introduction, this is me, John. I work out of our technology consulting practice in data analytics out of our office in Fargo, North Dakota. This is kind of our agenda for the day today. We're going to spend a little bit of time kind of framing the problem first. So the way we phrase that is every business has data problems. This is kind of a challenge in the modern economy with kind of the volume of data most businesses generate, as well as the volume of data that's available to them outside of their organization. And we're going to talk a little bit about, I always think it's good to level set and sort of make a definition. So when we're going to define data analytics or business intelligence, a little bit of that and kind of why it's important. And then we have this tagline that we think every company should become a data company. I have a few kind of examples in there about why we sort of describe what that means. We think it's very important for just about every industry. And I think I could point to some examples across industries that people would be very much surprised that it's relevant in that industry. But I think that it's a good kind of level set on kind of why this is important. Then kind of the meat of the presentation here is what we've defined as 8 steps to defining an effective data strategy. So to us, that's about what it means to become a data company and how to effectively use information across your organization. That's kind of what we're defining as a data strategy in that sense. We have 2 examples that we've labeled just real life results. So these are real organizations that have done something down that path of a data strategy to become more data driven and to use their data effectively as an organization. And we have a couple of examples there to sort of describe why that's important. And then we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So to kind of define the problem, what we've said is every business has data problems. And rather than try to come up with a very specific, what does it mean to have a data problem, try to come up with, hey, what are those kind of common challenges that most organizations have in this area and why are they relevant? So first thing I think is many organizations have a hard time finding what's important. And I put in here, I said, big data sometimes equals a big puzzle, but trying to find the data that's most relevant in your organization is sometimes a challenge. Anytime we start resorting to, I'm going to run a report out of this system, run a report out of another one, and I'm going to kind of combine them in Excel, do all those kinds of things. What happens is people start to reference that data in the future as if it's kind of that single source of the truth, when maybe it's not. So finding the data that is important is sometimes a challenge in and of itself in a world where we kind of have more data available to us. It's kind of that finding the forest for the trees or the needle in the haystack type of analogy. Second problem that people frequently have is inaccurate data, because we haven't necessarily gotten the data that we're referencing for making business decisions from kind of the source of the truth or where it's created. Oftentimes the data gets inaccurate as it propagates through the organization. It's kind of like that old analogy of the game of telephone, right? The more you get removed from the source data, the less likely it is to be accurate. So I think that's an important point as well. And the second one, or the third one listed here, is really that, are you looking in the rearview mirror or you're looking forward? So quite frequently we find ourselves looking in the rearview mirror, especially we have obviously a lot of CPAs and accountants on a webinar from Eide, especially accountants. We tend to look back, and I'm not in that category, by the way, but we do as accountants, I think, tend to look at financial statements, and they're a great tool, but the reality is they aren't necessarily a good tool to look forward. They're telling us what happened last month, and an awful lot of, I always say, water has run under the bridge since the last time we looked at that. Fourth problem is we, in a world of great modern systems and great sources of kind of business process automation, all those types of things, what's happened is we've created these little islands of information around the organization. So we've kind of got these disparate systems, and we've got those little islands of data throughout our organization, and we've never really been able to pull them together, or we don't pull them together to help us make better decisions. The fifth problem that we think is important to articulate is there's just a lack of timely access. So if you're thinking, boy, I know those answers are in there somewhere in my systems, but I've got to go have somebody from IT track things down, create a report, and then that's going to drive creating another report, those kind of things. Odds are you don't have very timely access to information. You're trying to make a decision for your business, and you don't have great timely access to the information, that's kind of that fifth problem that we think is relevant for this type of discussion. So with that, we're going to go into kind of a brief definition here of business intelligence or data analytics. But again, that'll be relatively brief in terms of our content. I'm not going to read these two specific definitions, but I thought it was good to have them at least from a documentation perspective. So that kind of qualitative and quantitative techniques, I think, is important as a part of the data analytics definition. We're going to use these a little bit interchangeably for the purposes of our presentation today. But I think it's important to highlight a few things. That data is extracted and categorized to identify and analyze behavioral data and patterns. So think of it as I'm going to pull that data out. I'm going to try to find something out about my organization and the performance of it. And then I think that business intelligence, you'll kind of hear that term, that umbrella term that covers a lot of different things. But think of this as kind of the intersection between your data and your ability to make good decisions around it. We use the tagline, solve data problems. That's what you're trying to do with data analytics and business intelligence. When you kind of boil it all down, that's really your goal and why you're going down an effort with data analytics. A couple things relative to that definition that I think are important as well. We're big believers in this "what gets measured gets managed" quote to the right of the screen here from Peter Drucker, and you'll see that attributed to a few others as well. And also that kind of to measure is to know. One of my colleagues always says, "Don't guess, know." So when you're looking at the data, don't guess what your performance looks like at this moment in time. You need to know, what are we doing right now? And that's really what business intelligence is about. It's a better way to improve performance. It's better than working harder. It's better than a lot of other things. Get visibility and behavior changes. That's really what gets measured gets managed quote is about. If you put a number out there as an organization, the leadership of the organization puts it out and says this number is important, almost always it will move. People are inherently competitive and want to do a good job is what we believe. So big believers in that kind of theory. So with that, Amy, I'll turn it over to you for the first polling question.
All right. Our first polling question here. Data analytics is used to enhance productivity.
All right, so we're going to now move into the second kind of main section here, which we've said every company should become a data company. And this is kind of making the case for why does it matter across your organization. So we're going to start a little bit with what we call the maturity model. You'll see this is adapted from an organization called Gartner. Gartner's an IT research organization is the way to think of it for those people who aren't familiar with them. But they kind of say there are sort of these four phases in your maturity of data analytics. There's descriptive analytics, and that's kind of what happened. There's diagnostic analytics, why did it happen? Predictive is, well, what's going to happen, what will happen? Or then prescriptive, which is kind of the technology saying, well, here's what you should do about it. We've kind of taken that and said, this is sort of that journey to becoming data-driven. One of the things I tell clients all the time is that there's really no replacement for going down that path. It's very difficult to say, well, I'm just going to start and get prescriptive or predictive right out of the gate. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Oftentimes, you don't necessarily even know what you want to do if you were to try to start there. So there's really kind of no replacement for going down that path. We think this is important. If you think about becoming a data company, think about moving along this axis to get more and more mature in your thought processes and use of data. Highlight one other thing there, that the line at the top there that says the value of your data increases as your ability to use it matures. So think about it if you're just looking at the descriptive end of things. Here's what just happened last month looking at a financial statement. That's great. But if I can look at the data and it can tell me what to do before I get to the next one and change my results, to us, that's predictive and prescriptive, right? So the value of that data has gone up quite substantially for your organization because now I have the ability to change the result. Think of this as a much more advanced thing of if I'm just looking at sales, revenue, it tells me something about what my financial result's going to be. Think about KPIs, key performance indicators that help you get more predictive and improve results throughout the month. The other part about becoming a data-driven organization that we think is important is this tagline at the top that says the winners in the new economy will be the ones who find the value trapped in their data. And that's very much the premise of this whole webinar. I won't take you through all the details on these, but these are kind of what are loosely defined as past industrial revolutions. So kind of that first one is about mechanical production. The second one is really the mass production. So people think about Ford and the Model T and making cars. We built production lines, all those types of things. Clearly we've all been through this automation. The third one, really the fourth one, and if you think about this has been going on for a little while. This is not an entirely new concept. It's just that it's getting gotten a little bit more democratized and available to everybody, we would say. And that fourth one is really about data. This, you can see the source for this is a Fortune article from the World Economic Forum. But if you really look at the URL and you see the date's 2016. So we've been here for a little while at this point. What's happening though is that this is becoming easier to deliver. It's becoming more available from a cost perspective to a typical Eide Bailly client anyway. And the tools and techniques are getting better. So we're getting a lot better at applying the use of data to improve the business result. And that's really what that kind of fourth industrial revolution is about. So what is a data company? Rather than to come up with a big long definition here, we tried to just give you some descriptors that say, well, this is what a data company is. Data companies treat their data as an asset. So the data that they're collecting as a company, this is a competitive weapon we want to go use in the marketplace. They enable executives to make better decisions. So we've got the data. If you're an executive in your organization, a data company, you feel like you have the data in front of you to make effective business decisions. They also, though, provide visibility to the frontline staff. So some of the process improvement works that my colleagues have worked on, that's a big component of it. So give them visibility to what do they need to do from a frontline staff perspective. They also have the discipline to use the data. So one of the things is that we all collect a ton of data. I do a lot of work in healthcare, and I can tell you definitively that in healthcare, we've been collecting data, putting it into electronic health records and various systems of record for a very long time. We're really just now starting to use that information to change results and outcomes in healthcare. So data companies, they have the discipline to apply it and to improve performance using the data. They also develop a deeper understanding of their customers and competitors. So actually a great storyline for this one, if you follow this industry at all. Another solution that we work with at Eide Bailly here, Salesforce, recently just purchased or announced their intent to purchase Tableau. Tableau is a visualization company in this data analytics space. That's really about using Tableau's technology, at least in part, to develop deeper understandings of customers and competitors, right? So you think of Salesforce's core business around customer relationship management, data analytics is obviously a very key component to that. So I think that's a great, timely story about that. The last one on here is that data companies adapt their measures over time. One of the things that we found in our use of this is we have maybe some very specific measures that we look at that are tell us how the business is performing. But the reality is that you get good at a few of those things, and it's time to move on to the next one. We're actually, in my opinion, for our business, right in the middle of that cycle right now. We've got a few measures. We're pretty good at them. We've kind of gotten what we're going to get out of that measure. It's probably time to move on to the next one. But we think the bottom line is what it says at the bottom of the page here. Data companies compete and win in their markets. So they've figured out how to take data and make it an asset to go compete and win. So with that, Amy, we'll move on to polling question 2.
All righty. The second polling question here is a multiple choice. So data companies can, and you can see there your options there.
So now kind of what I've labeled as sort of the meat of the presentation is going to focus on what we think is our 8 steps to an effective data strategy. If you recall from the very start, we think this is kind of that, how do you apply data to your business to make it sort of that competitive asset to go compete and win in the marketplace. We think that largely starts with almost stepping back and looking at, well, how are we going to do that? What's the data that we're going to use? All those kind of things. So with that sort of methodology in mind, we've defined what we think are 8 critical steps for doing that and how they apply to most businesses. So the first one, we've said the first step is engage business leaders. And actually, this is content taken from a organization that Eide Bailly belongs to in healthcare called the Advisory Board. I think you'd find very similar results across almost all industry, though, or all industries. And that is that we would say engage business leaders. But if you look carefully at the slide and a couple things that are highlighted on it, in a span of 3 or 4 years, 2015 to 2018, you look at who does the work. And it really, if you kind of pay close attention, it was very heavily weighted towards maybe kind of a more IT-focused organization in the past. You see a pretty dramatic shift. In this case, they're saying shared leadership. I don't know that that's necessarily the most important point here. Probably the most important point is that it's not an IT initiative. So if I think about how we do this work at Eide Bailly, it's largely industry experts. So we bring healthcare experts to a client and we bring our technology and data analytics experts together to provide the most value. It's very much the same thing with an internal team doing this. If you think that, oh, my IT people have this, you're probably missing the boat. So engage with business leaders. And part of that is about understanding the content, but also I think part of it is those business leaders, when they look at the data, they look at some of maybe your early results when you're all the way on the left in that maturity continuum that we talked about before. They're going to look at that and you'll get better content. So they'll find what those future questions are, what those future measures are, much faster than an IT person alone will. And I'm at least partially on the IT side of that. So that's sort of my competency and skill set. But it really, at the end of the day, that sort of shared leadership, combine the IT skills with some business or industry skill set is particularly important. C-suite people, IT or business leaders, that's who drives successful data analytics and efforts and an effective data strategy. Second thing is understanding your source data. And we alluded to this a little bit early on in the very start of the presentation or start of the webinar here. But you really need to understand the data you're looking at. One of the little bit of an aside story, Eide Bailey recently merged in a data analytics practice called Zerva. And they'll talk about clients where they've made horrible decisions around people, all those kind of things before they got to the data warehouse. I really kind of think that's an appropriate example here. You've got to get good data in front of you to make good decisions. Otherwise, you might be making bad decisions and not even know it. So at the end of the day, what that is that's kind of the theme for understanding your data source. So what do we mean by that? We mean by that, where's the truth? So I always say, get the data from where it originates. If you want the truth, you don't want to get it through that model where it's 16 steps removed, that telephone kind of example. You want to get the data where it originates. So start with data at its source. Second thing is, I think there's a natural or a kind of a proper cadence for most data sources. So if you're looking at sales data and you want to compare one day to the next, you really don't maybe want data throughout the day. Now, if I'm comparing to the same point in a previous day, then you can maybe get it faster. But odds are, in many cases, there's that sort of natural cadence that you should go get data to add to your analytics environment. You want to follow that natural cadence. It can be very deceptive to look at data if you're not getting it across its kind of most useful cadence or schedule. Third point on here is using your data strategy as an opportunity to identify and fix problems in your data sources. Just about every time we've done this work, the first time you start to look at the analytics, somebody will say, well, that can't possibly be right. And usually when someone says that, it's because the source data is kind of dirty or not accurate. So just about always, you end up highlighting those kind of things. And this is an opportunity. When you understand your source data, this is an opportunity to go fix those problems. We've had cases where people were doing this with, more or less, I'll say, quote unquote, out of the box kind of products. And really they weren't happy with the analytics they were using. And really the source data was the problem. It really wasn't necessarily the analytics problem. The issue here, or the technique here, is to use that to identify and fix those problems. And the last one, I think, is one of the more interesting ones. It does sort of dovetail off one of the other 8 strategies here, but frequently there's a need to collect and harvest new data to meet your analytics needs. So you'll find a source of data that, well, we don't have that, right? We don't have that information. So you'll change something in your business process that says, well, now I need to put some technology in place to go collect it. I need to go outside my organization to get it, whatever it might be. But frequently you'll find, well, maybe I'm missing that data. That's an opportunity as well. So second thing in your data strategy is to kind of understand all of those sources and how do they fit into that strategy. Third one, and this is a reasonable transition off of that as well, is to consider external data. So what do we mean by external data? Sometimes these are things you subscribe to. So we've got retailers that get data from Nielsen. So that's kind of barcode scan data at a retail level. There's a ton of sources of these in healthcare. But consider adding those to your kind of data strategy, and how do they apply to your business, and how do you increase the value by overlaying or adding them to data that you're collecting. So we've got 5 kind of examples here. Railcar data is one that I've learned about that is, I'll just say, at least relatively public. It gets you an idea of where data is shipped and moved in and around the transportation or logistics system in this country. That data is public, so you can gain great insights about your competitors from some of that data. Second one, medical quality data. I won't go into a ton of detail there, but there are tons of sources from the federal government and various kind of quasi-government entities collecting quality data in healthcare. So, almost a regulated sort of thing that they have to collect it. If you're a healthcare provider, adding those things into your internal analytics efforts can be quite valuable. They're all available today, and one argument is, well, I'll just go look at them. But the problem is they're not very accessible. So they're hard to distribute throughout your organization, and they also can be quite valuable when they're added to your internally collected and managed data. I think weather data is a great example when you start to think ahead to the more predictive types of analytics things. I always think of it a really simple one. If you're a ski resort, what the snow forecast looks like could be quite predictive as to how many people are going to come skiing. That's obviously a very simple example, but you really can use that data to help get predictive in your analytics. Census data is one that we think is relatively interesting. So that's, again, data that you can obtain publicly. Gives you things like income by zip code in the country. So if that's particularly important for you to analyze where you're going to locate a next location or another office, something like that, that's interesting. And then GIS data is similar. So think data that you can look by zip all the way down to a zip code kind of level. Most of the business analytics or business intelligence tools are getting pretty effective at that sort of geospatial analysis. So you can look at things on maps and things along those nature. That's, I believe, some of the more exciting stuff that you're going to start to see in this field in the coming years. The fourth key point to a data strategy is to consolidate and transform your data. So again, I'm not going to necessarily go into great technical detail here, but I do think it is important to understand that you want to create that sort of single source of the truth. I've also said kind of create that data asset, so something you can go compete off of in the marketplace. So this slide is really about, in large part, about sort of creating a data warehouse. So what that means is go to those disparate systems that we referenced earlier. Data lake is kind of unaltered, think of that as, but then you're really creating that asset to go report off of. So everybody's looking at the same thing. What's listed here is semantic layer, but really just doesn't necessarily matter how you present it at that point. There are a whole host of tools that are appropriate. There really is no one single answer there, but get to the heavy lifting is done before that. If you look at the maturity model example before, oftentimes people sort of skip all this stuff in the middle and they go right to reporting. And that's not wrong. We've actually done a lot of that at Eide. We've done a lot of that with our clients. But when you really want to kind of get to the heart of your data strategy, you really, at the end of the day, need to have a method to kind of consolidate and transform that data and make it more reportable and available and accessible, all those kind of things. Fifth element of an effective data strategy that we've identified is to tell effective stories. And I think that for the accountants on the webinar, it's probably one of the hardest parts here. I'm a relatively analytical kind of person. I always say that I don't use kind of the creative half of my brain quite frequently. And that's what you need to do to effectively communicate around data analytics and effectively tell stories and make this kind of data an asset for your organization. So a big part of an effective data strategy is to think beyond kind of those traditional financial statements. As accountants, many folks on the webinar just soon look at a P&L, look at a balance sheet, all those kind of things. Those are all great tools, but the reality is that there's a lot more out there in today's world from a reporting perspective. I try to simplify this one down to sort of the two pictures. Think the sort of picture that says, hey, look at those KPIs down the side. I can look at that very quickly. I don't need to be an accountant. And I more or less know, all right, on these three measures, things generally look good and they're trending up. And there's one of those that's maybe not so good. It's trending down. We've got a problem. Let's go dig into that a little further. So from a business perspective, it gives me a very quick kind of snapshot view of performance. One of the things I've said on that one is that it can kind of turn sort of a marginal department head leader, whatever you want to think of it as, into a rock star, because the leaders in the organization said, go look at these numbers and manage to these. You can keep these things going in the right direction. It produces a financial result or a quality result or whatever the particular kind of domain of influence is across the organization. I read a book from a pretty well-known author in this field, and she says to focus on the pearls. So don't focus on all the oysters you had to open. Find a few things that are really relevant to your organization and performance, and those things that really talk about quality, performance, and results, and focus on the pearls. The temptation here is to almost create the visual version of the chart on the right. So I'm going to throw out 100 different visuals, and we're going to go look at all this stuff. The reality is, there's kind of an art to this. Step back and paint the picture about the business's performance that you're trying to paint. And sometimes less is more, especially early on in your kind of journey to becoming data-driven. And with that, we'll move on to the third polling question.
Okay. The third polling question, the best insights usually take data from more than one source. True or false?
Actually, that's a point I didn't probably highlight enough, but it looks like everybody generally has it anyway. So I do think that is an important point. Oftentimes people start this data analytics journey or strategy around trying to improve reporting out of their ERP system or out of some other system in their environment. The reality is when you combine and overlay the data from multiple sources is when you really do get a lot of value. All right. So we're going to keep going down that list of 8 elements of a successful data strategy. The sixth one, to me, I've used this term in a few other topics as well beyond data analytics, but I do think establishing some level of operational discipline is particularly important. So what do we mean by that? I think that in some ways you can describe it by characteristics. So what happens is over time, maintaining that data asset or that data warehouse or data asset that we described earlier becomes a little bit of a burden because the source systems change, business processes change, people change, and kind of the flavor of the day, if you will, for trying to manage the business. So all of those things kind of change, and what happens is then it maybe becomes not relevant. So you've got to kind of maybe retool a little bit to make the content you're looking at relevant. The bottom line here is that the one thing that stays static is that you can turn that into a reliable asset. It has to stay in sync with the business and the goals that you're trying to, and the methods you use to manage the business. So it has to stay, to that second point, reliable and trusted. If people are looking at data, and this kind of goes back to the understand your sources, the second one from the list, but if people are looking at your data analytics solutions and your asset and they don't trust it, they'll quickly ignore it and they'll move on to the next thing. So you have to have the discipline to keep the data A, relevant, and B, accurate and trusted. So how do you do that? I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's probably not much different than in a lot of other parts of your business. You either hire it or outsource it. So you just need to figure out what's right for your organization. And sometimes it's start one path and move down the other eventually when you mature. But you really do need to kind of establish that kind of discipline around data in your organization. And once you've established the accuracy and the effectiveness of it, you really can't question it at that point. So from an organization perspective, there's really no, well, my spreadsheet says this or my system says that. You really need to all be kind of singing off that same sheet of music. That's what we mean when we say operational discipline. You need to have a way to kind of combine content and make it relevant and keep it relevant to the business. Seventh element of an effective data strategy is identifying leading indicators. So I've said this one a couple of times in the presentations. Financial statements are great tools. However, and you can kind of fill in the blanks there, but what I say is they don't tell you what happened today necessarily. So here's exactly what happened in today's performance, or maybe more importantly, in the past hour. From some tech businesses or some tech-driven businesses, you might be wanting to look at things even more frequently. That gets to that cadence comment that I made earlier. But we really need things that fill in the blanks in the white space between financial statements. So when we're looking at the results of the business, I think of our own use case. We look at analytics, some things daily, some things weekly. And honestly, we look at them then, and then we go look at the results when we get to the month close and we have an idea. A, we're not surprised generally, so you generally know what that's going to stay. And then B, you almost let go of some of those operational analytics and move on to the next one, the next month or the next period between financial statements. They're almost not, it's not that they're not important, but the context is different. When you go back and look at them, then it's really just about kind of the trends and all those kind of things. Key thing on this, though, is that eventually those elements in your data analytics can become predictive. So there are those things that allow you to look forward versus looking in the rearview mirror. Every business here is different. I can't necessarily say what those need to be, but I will tell you this: when you move up that maturity model, it becomes very apparent which things are predictive of your financial performance. There are a few not obvious ones in healthcare. In healthcare, you would just think it's all about, I go take care of my clients or my patients, I submit claims and I get paid and I move on. A lot of things like the productivity of your physicians are a huge indicator of what financial performance is going to be. So if your physicians are seeing enough patients and you're doing it without an impact on quality, all those kind of interrelationships, those are what get to be leading or predictive indicators. From a business manager's perspective, this is a huge deal. All of a sudden, you really feel like you're looking forward and not looking backwards. And it gives leaders great confidence that to kind of manage and run the business effectively. So our eighth element or strategy or element of an effective data strategy is to continue to innovate. This largely gets to those descriptors of what's a data company, but adaptability is a key competency to develop. So the reality is that you're going to get good at it. You're going to look at some of these measures and say, oh, we've got that one figured out. It's time to move on to the next one. It's not that you quit measuring it. You almost sort of think of it as put it aside and put it in a monitoring phase where I'm just going to look at it and say, yeah, I get it. I've got that one figured out. I've got the business processes. I've got my sales process, whatever it is, all kind of fine-tuned to support that metric. And I just kind of want to know if it gets outside of the ordinary, and I'm going to get maybe slight incremental improvement on an ongoing basis there. But then it's time to move on to those next ones. That's kind of the third point here that says adjust your primary measures and KPIs. So what am I going to go improve next? One of my colleagues actually says the last point on here, which is use data as fuel for your process improvement efforts. It's like pouring gas on it. If you're trying to do this stuff manually and just saying, well, here, if you did this, I know I'd knock a few minutes or a few seconds off of a transaction or a piece of business process work, that's great. But the reality is analytics in the right hands kind of light that up. And all of a sudden you can see those performance challenges and gaps, and all those types of things. As you move up that maturity model, there's really no replacement for kind of that journey as I described earlier. So think about that maturity model as you becoming more innovative and executing on this eighth element of an effective data strategy, which is moving up that ladder to get more innovative. I think it's very rare you find an organization that across the business, they might be doing it in one department or one functional area, is really on that prescriptive or predictive side of things. They might be doing it in sales, or they might be doing it in kind of an operations area of some sort. Almost nobody in today's world has that kind of humming and working the way that you'd want it to work across the organization. So continue to innovate. This is one of those things that the data, if it's not providing you the ability to do that in the insights to where you should go innovate, there's probably a gap in what you're doing, and it's time to step back and think a little bit differently about it. So collectively, those are what we think are the elements of an effective data strategy. So with that, we'll move on to question 4.
Well, in question number 4, a data strategy can, and then you have your multiple choices there.
All right. So if we think about the application of that data strategy, we kind of felt like it was good to hear some real life results. No names or anything will be on these, but we do have a couple of good sort of case studies that we think are important for the group to hear and sort of understand that here's how this can be applied. And these are intentionally not necessarily about the technology. So we'll talk through 2 specific cases and sort of what the business impact was and why it's relevant to this particular client, in this case for us. So the first one is an orthopedic clinic. The business problem in this particular case is trying to get more efficient and increase the throughput of the clinic. Now that's not, in healthcare, that's always a delicate balance, right? We clearly don't want to impact the quality or impact results. It's just suffices to say we've got measures we can look at to know whether that's the case. I will tell you that, the default answer for many people is, well, I don't want to just kind of run people through the system. They don't want to feel that way. In this case, I think that the client and Eide Bailey collectively came up with a relatively innovative way to think about this. And at the end of the day, the focus is on eliminating those things that are not, we would say, value added in the care process. So the solution here has a lot of the elements of the data strategy that we talked about. That's kind of why we picked this one to sort of highlight and make use of for the presentation today. Clearly, it's kind of that process improvement effort with fuel poured on it through data, that kind of thing. So it's definitely starts as, well, what are we going to try to do to make the care process more efficient? And then we kind of use data to support it. We also have, there's an acronym on here that maybe not too many people are familiar with, RTLS. It's real-time location service or system. Gives you the ability to sort of just think of it as track people and things around a clinic or around really any environment. So you sort of tag people with a device, and it allows them to watch, allows the system to kind of watch where they're going. So that is one of those data sources. So when I said understand your source data, sometimes you'll find I've got a blind spot, meaning I don't have the data I need to collect, or I'm not collecting the data I need to make an effective decision. That's what RTLS provided in this case. Provides a key data point to understand what your processes look like. If you're a manufacturer, a lot of this is probably data locked up inside your manufacturing systems. So you've got something running the manufacturing floor. That's kind of the equivalent here. So what were the measures? The two key measures that we focused on in this effort were, we would say, value-added and non-value-added time. There are definitely others, but these, I think, are the two that are maybe the most prevalent in the use. Value-added time is defined essentially as, if it's directly related to patient care, think of it as it's off limits. We're not going to touch the doctor's time with the patient. We're not going to touch the time documenting what the care plan is in an electronic health record. None of that. Non-value-added time is essentially everything else, and you're never going to get it to zero, but you really do want to increase value-added time and decrease non-value-added time is the simple way to look at it. So those were metrics that, before we kind of had the data analytics infrastructure in place, would have been very difficult to measure. You think of your typical experience going to a doctor's office, you really don't it'd be hard to know what percentage of that provider's time or doctor's time was spent directly with patients versus not with patients, or not doing value-added activities. So what's the result of this one? It's really kind of the three things I chose to highlight here are most important. A, we're seeing more patients, and then really the second point is directly dovetails off that, with fewer surgeons. Here in the healthcare, and we have several healthcare folks on the call today. If you're in healthcare, if you think about that, we're seeing more patients with fewer surgeons. That is a pretty powerful math. In this case, the number I don't have on here is it's something like 15 to 18% more productivity through the organization. Couple $1 million bottom line impact. That's a pretty powerful story. That's what it means to become a data company and have an effective data strategy. And this is really one small part of a larger health system. So it's just looking at an orthopedic clinic and how we can apply data to improve results and make the patient experience better. One thing I didn't necessarily totally finish the thought on there was the concept of, well, I don't want to just kind of push people through the system. This is about people's care and their health, all those kind of things. I think we're starting to see data support this, a theory that I've had for a little while, which is that really efficient healthcare generally equals a better patient experience. As we move towards, for those healthcare folks on the call, as we move towards a model where we're paid for outcomes or paid for value versus volume, the reality is that generally speaking, when I go to the doctor's office or I go to the hospital, I don't want to spend more time. I need to be there. I need to have the care. But we've eliminated or reduced those non-value added times. Think time in a waiting room, time waiting for the doctor to come visit me, those kind of things, through better visibility and through an effective data strategy. Second example is franchise service business. So the example here, this is largely, the initial case is largely around, well, let's get more efficient. But I think there's a key strategy here as well that maybe goes beyond that. So we've kind of got a costly manual reporting process. So we're manipulating the data. We're spending 380 hours of manual effort across 19 or 20 locations every single month. So there's a cost to that labor. You've eliminated through the data analytics implementation in this case. So the solutions data warehouse, it's extracted data from 8 different systems, 19 locations, and kind of the automated reporting that generates out of that. So the key measures are things like appointments, their cancellations, what our conversion rate is from a new opportunity, new subscriptions, so it's a subscription-oriented business, all those kinds of things. Result is those 380 hours, we've reduced it by roughly 75%. So the cost to go implement something like this is probably more than paid for just from something like that. This is a great example of, let's start our journey around automating what we're doing, kind of start on the left of that maturity model and start working our way up. It's a very, it's a very common use case to get started with data analytics. Clearly some automated report generation, all those kind of things. But I think one of the last things here is maybe the most important. If you think about a franchise business, it needs to scale effectively to have the financial model generally work for the franchisor. So if I'm trying to go out and grow a franchise business, it becomes particularly important that I can scale that business. Well, 380 hours of manual effort across 19 locations, that doesn't scale. A 75% reduction in that. Now, maybe the more important thing is, when I go add the next 19 locations, I don't have to double the remaining labor. So I've now got an ability to kind of expand my margins, expand my efficiency, and scale this business effectively across a much larger footprint than you have with just 19 locations. So I think those are two different stories. The first one is very much about efficiency of kind of the business process and delivering of care. And the second one is really, I'd say, about scalability of the business. We definitely got some efficiencies around the processes and elimination of labor, all those kind of things, kind of the traditional business case for data analytics. But an effective strategy in this case, I think, supports the scalability and growth of the business. So I'm not going to play the videos, or I didn't intend to play the videos today, but walk through the two examples today. But I wanted to, I know we share the content frequently with these as well. So we do have two kind of case studies that I think are good examples if you want to sort of see some of this stuff in action. These are very report focused. So one of them is healthcare. So this is kind of that RTLS case study, those kind of things. And we do the reporting in a tool called Power BI. At the end of the day, we're tool agnostic. It doesn't necessarily matter. I don't think there's any one tool that's the right answer for everybody. But these two links provide some detail on a use case. They kind of give you a video, a walkthrough of what the intelligence looks like for both a retail and a healthcare example. I think they're kind of a good example of where to start and how to apply the technology across your business. And the thing I want to leave everybody with is that everybody on the call today or on the webinar today should really be thinking about, well, how am I going to start my journey? What am I going to do? And if it's intimidating and it's something that you're not necessarily comfortable with, the answer is just start. One of the things I find as I talk to clients about this is that sometimes we have grand visions, and then those grand visions are great. But the reality is, how do you start a data analytics effort? How do you start a data strategy? The answer is just start. Pick one of those 8 effective elements of a strategy that we've articulated on, focus on that, and get started, because every one of them are important, and something that is about building kind of the discipline and the competency into the way you run your business. So the deal is there's no replacement for that journey, and just get started.
As we're waiting for some questions to come in, you can see our upcoming webinars on the screen for the month of June. And if you would like to attend those, just visit our website to get registered. Okay, we do have 2 questions. Yes, the presentation will be available for download. We will email out the recorded link within probably 10 to 14 days after this webinar. And keep in mind, viewing the recording will not be worth a CPE. And then the other question here is, for RTSL tracking, do the employees resist being tracked?
So it's RTLS. I would say that almost always initially, I think the key thing is to find some leaders in the organization. And in this case, our particular advocates were providers. So we found a provider that really wanted to lead it. The reality is, once you understand that you can get something out of it, I don't think there's substantial resistance to it. And what do you get out of it? If you're the physician, it's really one of 2 things. You're getting some work-life balance, if you will, meaning you're getting more efficiency in your day, or you're getting more production, meaning you're seeing more patients, you're doing more surgeries, you're doing more clinic visits with patients, whatever that might be, and that translates to more compensation in most cases, not always, but in most cases for a physician. So I would say that there's, the key thing is to find that cultural balance that allows them to get something personally out of that effort. But I definitely hear that. I understand the big brother, those kind of things. I think the other side of that is that when you equate it to a personal gain out of it, and then maybe B, higher patient satisfaction, all those kind of things that most people in healthcare are driven by. So I would say that it's definitely a risk. It's something to watch out for, but I haven't seen it be insurmountable by any means.
All right, well, that's the only 2 questions that have come through.
Okay,
So
well,
go ahead.
I was just going to say thanks to everybody for attending the webinar today. We appreciate your participation and the questions. If there's any other questions, as Amy said, we'll email a link to the presentation with my contact information there as well, or it's on the screen here as well. But thank you for your time, and everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks.